welcome to part 2 of my interview with Anya Jabour on the work she did on Mercy Street and talking about women and sexuality in the Civil War era. Kind of switching gears a little, I'm curious, during this time period, are there documentations of same-sex couples or of women posing as the opposite gender to succeed? Things that would be out of the norm for the day.
Yes, there are definitely historical examples of both of those things, but they existed in a very different context from one another. So 19th century Americans really revered what they regarded as the sort of primarily feminine domain of the heart and emotion and connectedness, right? And so they placed this very high value on emotional intimacy, which they, for the most part, thought of as being very different from physical sexuality, right? So lust was, kind of base and something that humans shared with animals, but love was idyllic and something that humans shared with the divine, right? And so since women were associated with that kind of pure, disembodied love, that meant that women's same-sex relationships were really very highly revered and were often considered to be the ideal relationships because they were not in any way tainted either by, that nasty animal-like lust, supposedly, and also because they were not tainted by practical, pragmatic considerations, i.e. women had to marry because they had to have someone to support them, right? So therefore, female-to-female relationships were really viewed as the ideal, and until a couple of decades after the Civil War, were not perceived as being sexual relationships. What that meant in this kind of odd way was that this kind of cultural blindness to the possibility even that there was such a thing as same-sex sexuality where two women were concerned, men are a different issue, was that women could engage in these incredibly intimate and romantic and in some cases almost certainly sexual relationships without ever running the risk of social stigma or or being shunned by society. So 19th century women wrote very unselfconsciously. I mean, they wrote letters that you could only describe as love letters. They say things like, I wish I could sleep with you tonight. Of course, we would not sleep much, would we? But we would love each other and hold each other in each other's arms and whisper in each other's ears all night long. And, from our perspective, you look at that and you're like, oh my God, they are so lesbians and they are so in love, right?
Yeah.
But that was commonplace, right? Yeah. And completely unselfconscious. There's without any sense that this was something that one needed to be ashamed of or that one needed to hide. 19th century Americans really, they placed a high value on privacy, but they also placed a very high value on self-revelation and this idea that you could share your inner self, your true self, your heart of hearts with another person, and that it was more likely that you were going to be able to do that with a person of your same gender. Because of your shared experience and background, and also because people believe that men and women were just kind of fundamentally different in terms of their capacity for emotional connection. So women's same-sex relationships then were completely acceptable and also completely invisible, right? So, and they often coexisted with heterosexual married life, with very conventional married life. So women who went to school together in the 19th century would have these passionate relationships all through school where they shared beds and they were never apart from one another, and when they wrote letters like the one I was just sort of paraphrasing for you, and then they would go back home, they would get married, they would would obviously sleep with their husbands, they would have children, but they would continue to have this kind of very intimate correspondence going on, which is why we have so much rich written documentation. And we also know from that written documentation that they would exchange long visits, and when they exchanged long visits, hubby got kicked out of the bedroom, so that the friends could be together. And everyone saw that as being perfectly normal.
Yeah.
And not problematic in any way. I mean, what would have been problematic is if you didn't have a friend like that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So there's that. And then there's cross-dressing, which was a completely different category. I mean, for historical reasons, we connect all of these different kinds of alternatives to heterosexuality and gender nonconformity. But but in that context, there was nothing non-conforming about loving a member of one's own sex. That was normal. I mean, that was conforming, right? You were supposed to love members of your own sex. Cross-dressing was definitely non-conforming, very non-conforming, and there were laws against doing it, and you could be jailed in most locations for dressing in clothing of the other gender, and women did it well before the Civil War. Generally speaking, working class women who were doing so because it gave them more options in terms of employment, or alternatively women who were traveling because dressing as a man meant that they were much less subject to sexual harassment and assault if they were traveling alone without a, quote, male protector.
Yeah.
Right? So hence, right, single self-supporting women, whether they were trying to get a job or were simply trying to travel from point A to point B in safety, had very good reasons for presenting themselves as men. The documentation is a little sketchy as to whether or not they actually identified themselves as men or simply self-consciously presented themselves as men. That's a little hard to get at from the historical record, right? I mean, you can say, okay, well, here's this female-bodied person who's wearing pants. So she's obviously presenting herself as a man. Does she actually think of herself as a man, or is this a calculated, strategy to reach a particular end? A little hard to say. A couple decades after the Civil War, you start to get a lot more documentation about that, and that's when you get the rise of the sexologists and the whole theory of the sexual invert and all that stuff. But that hasn't happened yet. As of the Civil War, that hasn't happened yet. So, and so it does appear that many women who cross-dressed did so for primarily, if not exclusively, practical purposes. And that was certainly the case for the roughly 300 women who dressed as men and served in the Civil War as soldiers.
Wow, I did not know there was so many.
Yes.
Wow.
So, yeah, they wanted to fight. Women couldn't fight, so they became men for the duration. Some of them continued to live as men after the war. Some of them immediately reverted to their previous identity. Some of them were discovered during the war, since if you're injured and you get undressed in the hospital, that can be a little difficult to hide. But unless that happened, it was pretty easy to hide, right? Because there were so many underage soldiers that it really wouldn't matter if a person in a man's uniform had no facial hair and did not have a particularly deep voice. Well, so what? I mean, that was true of the 14 and 15 and 16-year-old males in the Army as well, right? So in that sense, it was really quite easy to pass. And of course, it's not like Victorian clothing for either men or women was particularly revealing. So, so, I mean, as long as you can keep your clothes on, it's pretty easy to pass if that's your desire.
So what would the repercussions be for being discovered, say, in the Army, and you're a woman and it's discovered in a fashion?
Well, you would probably be sent to military prison. And moreover, you would be sent to military prison. You would have to wear the clothes assigned to your gender. You couldn't wear the others. That would be illegal. I mean, there are documented cases, though, of women. I think it's Sarah Emma Edmonds. All these people have 3 names, so it's very confusing. But I think it's Sarah Emma Edmonds, who was arrested numerous times for dressing as a man, but she kept doing it anyway. And she served in the Army, and she originally wrote a memoir of her experiences, which is why we know so much about her.
So I just wanted to thank you so much for being on my show.
My pleasure.
And I was just wondering if there was anything else that you would like to add about Mercy Street or about Civil War life or anything like that.
Sure. Well, the reason that I got involved with Mercy Street was because I saw it as an opportunity to finally tell a different story of the Civil War to the broader American public. I mean, I have been teaching women's history and the history of ordinary people and the history of African Americans and the history of everyday life at the University of Montana for 20 years. And, you know, I've probably reached 1,000 or maybe 2,000 people, right?
Yeah.
But in one night, the first night, Mercy Street reached 3.3 million people. So my hope is that with a show like Mercy Street, some of the really, to me, most exciting parts of American history and the history of the American Civil War in particular, and the ways in which it opened up new opportunities for formerly subordinated people to challenge the system and demand greater opportunities. My hope is that Mercy Street will introduce much larger audience than my own personal classes to that kind of history.
Thank you for watching this episode of Beneath the Covers, and thank you, Anya, for coming and bestowing some wisdom and knowledge upon us. It was very fascinating. I definitely learned a lot today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I love talking about this stuff.
Yeah, it looks like it. You're so knowledgeable. And please remember to tune in and watch Mercy Street on PBS. And as always, please remember to keep open minds and open hearts, and I will see you all in the next video. If you liked this video and would like to see more content like it, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe below.